distinguished foreign policy specialist, Mr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, Dr. Jehan Pereira, Sankita Gunaratna, distinguished participants, friends. I'm pleased to be here today to support and also appreciate the tremendous contribution made by Mr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera in the foreign policy arena, and also being an active participant in Sri Lanka's national security and defense policy. I was rather surprised that I would be made to speak a few words. I'm a bit hesitant to do so since I did not have adequate time to go through the book in its totality. However, I would like to use this opportunity to express a few sentiments regarding diplomacy, foreign policy, external affairs, whatever acronym that you may coin to describe interstate relations. Diplomacy and international relations is an instrument of state power. An instrument of state power which is available to governments of nation states to advance their national interests. So the first thing that one has to examine as far as Sri Lanka's history in terms of using this very valuable state instrument to advance national interest. Do we as a country possess a coherent policy-making process in order to have good policy resultants that accrues benefit to the country? It is my perspective and contention that Sri Lanka's foreign policy decision-making process, especially in recent years, have been extremely ad hoc, highly amateurish, primarily based on knee-jerk reactions. This is one of the major deficiencies that I find in Sri Lanka's foreign policy decision-making apparatus. We all know that policy-making processes determined by rationality has provided many a success in the external affairs of many nation states. It is very important that we have proper policy inputs. It is very important that requisite policies are formulated. Then we have to ensure that the policies that are formulated are implemented on the ground. And we also need to have a proper evaluation, monitoring, and feedback process, which should provide the decision makers with the opportunity to make corrective measures. So I would like to ask members of the audience, does Sri Lanka possess such a rational foreign policy decision making process? I doubt it very much. I will use this opportunity to express to you that a proper policy decision making process, not only in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the numerous sectors that governmental decision making is of great importance. We will have a structured method so that the ultimate policy resultants are in the national interest of the country. From history, I would like to illustrate a classic example of prudent, rational, national interest related policy, which enabled Japan to become a global economic power, that propelled the rise of the so-called Asian economic tigers. In the aftermath of World War II, when the Allied powers imposed immense constraints and restrictions on Japan, on its security structure, Japan was not allowed to maintain an armed force, merely a self-defense force. Yoshida, who was the prime minister at that time, he devised a smart foreign policy which was aimed at making Japan a global economic power. So what were the main elements of this policy? Since there were restrictions on military expenditures, defense expenditures, restrictions on the number of forces and their ability to become involved in various military engagements, even joint exercises, Yoshida, together with his expert group of advisors, and there were many, devised a program whereby Japan would come under the defense umbrella of the United States, strategically reduce resources and monies allocated for defense expenditure, use such resources to promote export-led economic growth. This was known as the Yoshida Doctrine. So Japan's security interests were protected because of the protection provided by the US nuclear umbrella, as it was known at that time. and the various security and defense pacts that Japan signed up to with the United States. Having done so, having secured the military security aspect of the protection of the country, protecting the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, the Japanese political leadership transferred humongous amounts of resources and funds to promote foreign economic diplomacy. MITI, one of the major Japanese governmental institutions, Ministry of Trade and Industry, well known as the economic arm of Japan's foreign diplomacy during the 50s and 60s. And you had Japan achieving extremely successful rates of economic growth. Economic growth propelled and sustained by Japan's exports. Now, why I mentioned this example is Prime Minister Yoshida has been a shining example of classic, masterful public policy decision making, both in the domestic and external spheres. First, ascertaining the constrained and restricted environment in which Japan had to operate, but using those very same constraints, restrictions, and limitations to ensure that Japan reached its national economic goals. Now, this is the type of smart decision making that we hope to emulate once in government. Of course, right now, most would proclaim being a bankrupt country, being in the midst of a debt trap, that there is very little room to maneuver. I somewhat agree. However, even this situation of bankruptcy provides us with strategic opportunities, which we must use and exploit to promote our national interest. What's happening today is that Sri Lanka, endowed with a very, very favorable geographic location, a strategic location, which has become one of the main assets of our country. However, here we have a situation whereby the owner of that particular asset has become incompetent, and if I may use that word, impotent, in initiating policies that are favorable to the country. Rather, Sri Lanka has become a paradise in global power politics. This should not be the case. We should have the right-minded thinking, the innovativeness, the ability to be unique in devising and designing our own foreign policy, exploiting our strategic assets to our advantage, and ensure that we work with all countries that can add value to the country, value to Sri Lanka. Work with all of them. but ensure that the strategic partnerships that we establish accrues significant benefit to the country. And this certainly we can achieve, but we can only achieve through the establishment of a proper foreign policy decision-making structure, strengthening the institutions, enhancing and supporting a smart team, a human resource policy in the foreign policy arena that allows the best and the brightest an opportunity to contribute to Sri Lanka's foreign policy successes. Do we have authentic think tanks that provide governments and political parties with sound policy proposals? I remember with my experience in the British education system, and having also had the opportunity of interning for a senator for 2.5 years in the US Senate. Look at the tremendous amounts of sound think tanks that exist to initiate debate, to provide proposals for politicians in government and in opposition. Royal Institute of International Affairs comes to my mind. The famous Chatham House papers. International Institute for Strategic Studies, both in UK and in the US. Heritage Foundation, Brookings Institution. Number of institutions that provide authentic advice to decision makers. Do we have a counterpart in Sri Lanka? I don't think so. Unfortunately, successive governments, irrespective of their political ideology and inclinations, have continued to politicize the foreign policy apparatus. And it's high time that meritocracy, not family bandism nor aristocracy, that dominates the recruitment process for the Sri Lankan Foreign Service. Last, I heard the word values mentioned in some of the presentations, and I also heard the word national interest. Challenge or challenges that we face in devising and formulating a sound foreign policy is to ensure that both values, moral, ethical, social, economic, political, and also national interests, that they converge, that there's a congruence, that there's a place where both values and interests meet. And this is the difficult part in foreign policy decision making. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me and providing me with the opportunity for an impromptu speech. I'm happy to say that I recognized Asanga Abeyagoonasekera's talent many years ago. And I'm happy to say he's one of the main foreign policy advisors, advising me on a variety of issues and on a variety of sectors. both in terms of bilateral diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy. Today, Sri Lanka needs an expert-driven foreign policy. There is a dire need for those who are knowledgeable in international affairs to take a preeminent role in guiding our policies. And I can assure you, Asanga Abeyagoonasekera will perform a pivotal role in a future SJB alliance government. And this is not a statement that I'm making just because he's introducing one of his books. This I'm stating as a matter of fact, because it was right at the beginning of myself becoming the leader of the SJB that I invited him to be part of my team. Not because his father played a crucial role in my father's presidential electoral success, which he was. I went on the basis of reading what Asanga has written. I was going on the basis of watching him leading one of the major institutes which advised the government on defense and security policy. So at least in the initial stages, which I hope to continue in the future, I have followed my words to the fullest. I have, in fact, promoted Asanga based on merit, not based on friendship or other personal relationships. So I hope to finish this book soon, and I hope to gather more knowledge, because as an individual, I believe in gathering knowledge. Every moment, every second, every millisecond, one has to gather knowledge, because knowledge is an important ingredient in formulating policy. Unfortunately, at times I wonder whether Sri Lanka is geared to accept knowledge. Is Sri Lanka geared to prioritize and provide primacy to intelligence, knowledge, know-how? Or is Sri Lanka still guided and shaped by sentimentalities, emotion, prejudice, jingoism, extremism? I sincerely hope that former is true and the latter is no more. Thank you very much.